Yes. Kinda. Sorta. Not really. It's complicated. If you ask anyone who plays Mario 64 DS what's the biggest issue the game has, most likely they'll answer with the lack of analog controls. And it makes sense, right? This is a remake of Mario 64 after all, the game that pioneered movement in a 3D space via the implementation of an analog stick. Plenty of game critics over the years have brought up that the lack of analog controls in Mario 64 DS makes it a severely inferior product. It's not easy to find someone who will defend the D-pad controls of this version, let alone prefer them over the original. My personal takeaway is that the controls of Mario 64 DS with the D-pad isn't nearly as bad as most people say it is. However, I must admit I substantially prefer the controls in the original. There is a consideration to be made with the touchscreen in 64 DS. By using the touchscreen, you can essentially have analog controls in the DS version, though because there isn't any physical feedback nor a real center point because the icon moves as you do, it makes using the touchscreen extremely challenging to use. It's a far cry from using a real analog stick, to say the least, and it's why many people insist that this version would have been better off on 3DS, as if Nintendo had already conceptualized the 3DS back in 2004. Either way, it's safer to assume most people would play this version with the D-pad and simply associate it not having any analog controls. So far, it seems like a logical observation. Mario 64 DS doesn't use an analog stick, so clearly it doesn't control as well as the original, which did have an analog stick. But what if it did? What if Mario 64 DS was fully playable with an actual analog stick, completely negating all of the control issues people seem to have with 64 DS? Before we get into that, I want to take a moment and talk about the D-pad controls in the DS version because it's so contentious. While most people flat out despise using the D-pad in Mario 64 DS, I think it's important to acknowledge how Nintendo accommodated Mario 64 DS to better fit a D-pad control scheme. To understand what I mean is to understand how bad the D-pad controls could have been. Let's take a look at Mario 64 via the 3D All-Stars port for Switch. For some reason, Nintendo decided to let this version be playable with the D-pad, and playing it this way makes me appreciate how well the DS version handled to begin with. As you can see, Mario turns very abruptly, and maneuvers such as the side somersault are incredibly imprecise. After playing it for just a few minutes, it's obvious that Mario 64's controls were never meant for a D-pad. The level design rarely complements 8-directional movement, and even if it did, the abrupt turns and stiff movement still wouldn't have made it feel good to play. If anything, all it does is make me appreciate just how good Mario 64 controls with an analog stick, even to this day. This all may seem like a no-brainer. Mario 64 was never meant for a D-pad, simple as that. So Mario 64 DS doesn't work as it doesn't use an analog stick. This would be a convincing argument, assuming Mario 64 DS even has the same controls as the original Mario 64. Before I get into that and dive into what 64 DS would feel like with an analog stick, I want to discuss how Nintendo adjusted Mario 64 DS to better work with the D-pad only control scheme. As I stated before, you can technically have analog controls in 64 DS by using the touchscreen. However, it's too awkward for it to be reliable, and Nintendo knew this. They knew most people would just use the D-pad in this situation, so they chose to alter the game in a few ways to make the D-pad as comfortable as possible. Let's start with the camera, and I'll be using Lethal Lava Land as an example. As you can see, the camera can only be moved in set increments and can only point in 8 directions. This is even more apparent on the minimap. These camera angles weren't like this in the original. This was a change they did for this remake. It was done so that you could more comfortably traverse this rather hazardous level with only 8-directional movement, something that a D-pad excels at. Now, not every stage in the game is like this. Any level that's more open-ended has a more free-moving camera since precise movement isn't as necessary. More linear stages, however, such as Rainbow Ride and the Bowser stages, have the camera locked in 8 directions to make using the D-pad more reliable. When it comes to the more open-ended levels, using a D-pad still could have been much worse, as the 3D All-Stars version demonstrates. If you've played Mario 64 DS with the D-pad, then you'll notice turning and diagonal movement isn't really snappy like 3D All-Stars. Mario gradually turns into the direction you press, rather than snapping to it instantly. It's kinda like Spyro with the D-pad, if you've ever played that. I know for some people, the turning still feels uncomfortable or even unnatural, but I would argue it was the right move on Nintendo's part, considering how poorly 3D All-Stars handled with the D-pad. This all leads to what would Mario 64 DS feel like with an actual analog stick? A question that's been pondered for many years since the game's release. The only way to do it before was to use an emulator and a program like Joy to Key to map the mouse to the touchscreen and then map the mouse to a controller's analog stick. It's a little complicated and a bit unwieldy, but it works more or less. I have played it in this way and it is a neat little tinker project, but I wouldn't call it a definite fix. Then sometime later, a program called Toxic Input was released, which patched Mario 64 DS to be fully playable with an analog stick on emulators, as well as implementing features like Rumble. This patch was then applied to the Virtual Console release of 64 DS on the Wii U eShop, which is also where all the footage you see came from. This patch is essentially the same mouse to touchscreen implementation that's been done for some time now, but with no work needed and far more consistent results. As far as getting analog controls in Mario 64 DS goes, this is by far the best it's going to get. So how does it feel? Well, it feels pretty good. As someone who grew up with both versions of Mario 64, playing the DS version with an analog stick is undeniably gratifying, like a handicap has finally been lifted. For anyone who simply couldn't get into the DS version because of the D-pad, then I couldn't recommend this patch enough. Even as someone who will defend the D-pad controls, I'll admit using an analog stick just feels better. However, the longer I played the game in this way, the more irritating nuances I started to notice. When I first started playing Mario 64 DS with analog controls with an analog stick, I initially thought it would make the DS version the best version of Mario 64 by default, as it really seemed like the lack of an analog stick was the only thing holding this version back. But the more I played, the less I believed that notion. Here's the bottom line that I've been building to. Mario 64 DS just doesn't control as well as the original, analog stick or otherwise. This was a thought that's been in the back of my mind ever since I started playing around with getting analog in 64 DS. However, now that we have these more advanced methods, this conclusion is more apparent than ever. Now, talking about controls in any game is extremely challenging as it's something you feel as you play, and it's not easy to describe how it feels. So let's do some comparisons, and I'll do my best to describe why and how I feel the DS version inherently controls worse than the original. I'll only be using Mario as he's the only character we can directly compare it to. Let's start with how diving works. Diving in Mario 64 carries over your momentum from whatever previous maneuver you last performed. What makes diving feel satisfying here is how you can string it together with other moves such as the side somersault and the triple jump. This is a common speedrun maneuver, and it's easy to pull off for most casual players too. The DS version changes the dive, however. Now it functions kind of like Mario Odyssey, where it cancels your momentum rather than building upon it. So dives all perform the same in the DS version regardless of whatever previous move you did beforehand. It may seem like a small thing that most people don't care about, but I sincerely believe it makes the DS version just a little less fun to play. One odd thing is how Mario's jumps in the DS version are way higher than the original, at least with the triple jump. I'm not going to say having a higher jump is a bad thing, but it may get in the way if you're really used to timing jumps in the original. A small grievance I have is that the swimming in the DS version feels really slow. In the original, you're encouraged to press rhythmic button presses rather than spamming the button to swim as fast as possible, with visual and audio cues to enforce it. In the DS version, it doesn't really work like that. Mario just feels slower when swimming. Probably done to make Luigi the best swimmer in the game, but it's still rather lame nonetheless. Next up is turning, which is particularly hard to describe. Remember how I explained earlier how snappy Mario 64 feels with the D-pad on the 3D All-Stars port? Well, this kind of snappy movement still applied to the analog stick, but it felt much better there because you have a lot more control over how Mario moves. Mario 64's snappy and responsive controls might make it a little harder to get into for new players today, but I believe that it allowed Mario 64 to have a natural skill curve where the more you play, the better you get. The DS version isn't nearly as responsive. Turning in the DS version is quite slippery compared to the N64 original, sort of like Sonic Heroes vs. 06. Mario's turning, and acceleration for that matter, doesn't feel as quick and responsive. At first it wasn't really bothering me, to be honest, but then I started to notice moves like the side somersault were surprisingly hard to execute in the DS version with an analog stick, even harder to get the maneuver to line up in the way that you want. I'm trying to perform the move here how I normally do it, which is rotating the stick in the opposite direction from where I was moving. But Mario, instead of instantly turning around, he rotates around instead, and then by jumping, he ends up doing this weird side jump thing which feels really awkward and can be a little dangerous depending on the situation. This admittedly has caused me to kill myself on a few occasions from muscle memory taking over. Of course, the solution here is just to snap the stick in the opposite direction rather than rotating it, which is probably how you're supposed to do it anyway. But again, muscle memory can be a hard thing to overcome with a control-heavy game like Mario 64. And I'm willing to bet this slight control quirk was done just to make the D-pad controls feel a little bit more comfortable, with the more gradual turning programmed deliberately to give the D-pad an emulated analog feel, while making using an actual analog stick feel not quite as tight, at least compared to the original. The cherry on top is the frankly jank-ass mid-air control. In Mario Odyssey, Mario would actually turn in mid-air, which gave you far more robust mid-air control. In previous Mario games, Mario would strafe in mid-air, which does inhibit control flexibility somewhat, but it was easy to account for. In Mario 64 DS, however, Mario's mid-air strafes are so goddamn sensitive that, at least for me, makes maneuvering Mario in mid-air so much more troubling than any other 3D Mario game. Of course, with a little focus and foresight, this control quirk can be avoided, but once again, muscle memory makes overcoming this rather challenging. Let's compare to the original. In both cases, the analog stick is being held at a 45-degree angle in mid-air, relative to where Mario is facing. As you can see, he's practically moving perpendicular to that in the DS version, whilst covering a lot more ground. You might say that this is simply allowing Mario more mid-air flexibility, but honestly, this is a case where more restrained controls feels better, and I'm also betting this was done to accommodate the D-pad. You know, after pondering all my observations and points that I've made throughout this video, I sort of realized that my conclusion is still the same as everyone else's, just for different reasons. The D-pad kinda kills Mario 64 DS, but not because playing with the D-pad is really terrible or anything, but because of how Nintendo altered Mario 64's controls to better complement it. I'll still say give Mario 64 DS with an analog stick a shot, as it is better than using the D-pad. Just understand that any control hiccup is probably because it was meant to be played with the D-pad. It's already been almost 20 years since Mario 64 DS, which is older than what the original was when the DS version came out. Since then, there's been decompilations, Windows ports, and model edits and shit for the original Mario 64. And since that version still controls superb in my honest opinion, those newfangled versions of Mario 64 are probably the best ones to play, despite the extra content the DS version added. I love Mario 64, and I love the way it controls, but the DS version doesn't control as well, analog stick or otherwise, so I'll love it a little less. It is nice to finally have the option at least to play with an analog stick after so many years, but how well it feels is entirely up to you. That'll be it for me today, so I just want to say thank you for watching.